When making judgments about leaders, any leader actually, it's essential to look at the context in which they lead, over which they have limited control, certainly early on. Some leaders are lucky. They become leaders in incredibly benevolent times. Who was lucky? Harold Wilson was lucky when he became leader in 1963 of his party in opposition, Tories falling apart at the time. Margaret Thatcher was pretty lucky when she became leader of her party in 1975, Labour government in a degree of disarray already. Tony Blair, very lucky in 1994 against a disintegrating Conservative government. When Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, indeed when he became Shadow Chancellor way back in 1992, he was pretty unlucky. He was doomed to face challenging contexts throughout his political career, and the judgment has to be made accordingly. We'll come to his leadership, his traumatic, turbulent, nerve-shredding period as Prime Minister, the job he had always ached to have, shortly. But it's worth looking back a bit at Brown's career. He became Shadow Chancellor in the most daunting context possible. It was after Labour's defeat in the 1992 election. The new leader was John Smith, who automatically made Brown Shadow Chancellor. And Brown went along to the party post-mortem that took place to analyse why the party had lost in 1992 when many expected them to win. And their polling and focus group guru, Philip Gould, spelt it out bluntly. He said, "We've lost our fourth election in a row because we're not trusted with the voters' money. They don't trust us with their taxes. They don't trust us to spend money wisely." That was Brown's inheritance as Shadow Chancellor. A party not trusted with the economy and seen through a very narrow prism. Tax and spend, that fatal phrase as far as Labour is concerned. But the challenge was much more daunting than that for Brown, to turn that round. It is that objectively, it was obvious by 1992 and certainly by 1997 that public spending needed to go up by a big amount. Public services were in deep decline by 1997. Hospitals in a bad shape, huge waiting times for operations, public transport in disarray, books at schools being battered and old, etc., etc. Many vivid images. So how was this still relatively young politician to square the circle, to win over trust, to spend and tax, and yet raise money for public spending? And in a way that I think is still underestimated, Brown more or less over a long period of time squared the circle. He began by being utterly unremitting in condemning any what he called Tory tax rise when he was Shadow Chancellor in those early 90s, and was absolutely tough on any spending pledge from a Labour frontbencher. They weren't allowed to make any. It made him internally deeply unpopular. I remember some of Brown's colleagues saying to me, "This guy, he's a Thatcherite. He won't let us spend a halfpenny in their theoretical spending pledges." But Brown knew he had to do this to regain that elusive political quality of trust. But he was planning over time to address the public spending crisis too. He knew they had to win trust first and then do it. Working with his relatively young, or actually really young advisor, Ed Balls, who he recruited from the Financial Times, and Ed Miliband, they were both in their 20s when they came to work with Gordon Brown. They worked a new framework, hugely influenced by Bill Clinton in the United States and Ed Ball's friend from the United States, Larry Summers, who worked with Clinton. They formed a new kind of left of centre framework, which worked for a time both electorally and economically. They established a kind of macro framework of rigid stability, Bank of England independence, so no government setting interest rates out of self-interest. They were tight on public spending, too tight actually, for the early years of the Labour government, sticking to the Tory spending plans. They didn't put up income tax and were committed not to do it for the first Parliament. Again, arguably, they should have done. But that, over time, won the trust of the electorate, which Labour had lost in the preceding years. And Brown stealthily started raising taxes. The taxes that people kind of don't notice. This is when he was Chancellor, not in opposition. In opposition, the only tax he mentioned was a popular tax, a tax on the privatised utilities, a one-off tax, which raised some money. Over time, as Chancellor, he began putting money into the public services. In the end, that too was going to be a huge problem, because in the same way that Harold Wilson became famous for being devious, if you're known for being devious, you're not going to be very devious. Brown became famous for being stealthy, a contradiction in terms. Oh, there he is again, putting up taxes that we don't notice. Well, if we're talking about it, we've noticed. But in the early years, it worked effectively. And no one else in Blair's cabinet, from Blair downwards, was giving much thought to economic policy. It had become all too much. Every attempt, it seemed, to reframe Labour's economic policy from some big figures when Labour was in opposition had been doomed, at least electorally. Brown had framed a policy, and Blair, basically, when he became leader, let Brown get on with it, that for a time was electorally popular and gave him ultimately the authority to do something extraordinary. When Blair, in a panic because the newspapers were going crazy about an NHS crisis, pledged without Brown knowing to put health spending up to the EU average, Blair was right to make the commitment given the level of crisis at the time, but wrong in the way he did it. Brown was both furious, apoplectic with fury at Blair for doing it in this way and not letting him making the announcement. But over time, Brown found a way through. After the 2001 election, which Labour won again by another landslide, he dared to do something that he thought he would never be able to do. He overtly put up national insurance, which is a tax as much as any other tax, to pay for increases in resources to the NHS. In Number 10, they were terrified. I remember bumping into someone the day before that budget who worked in Number 10, a very senior figure, still prominent in politics, who said, Gordon Brown's going to announce a tax rise tomorrow. I think he's just lost us the next election. As it turned out, it proved to be his most popular budget. It was in 2002. Polls that followed gave huge approval because people aren't daft. They saw the health service in trouble. They knew one way or another they had to pay for it. It got kind of 68% approval rates in opinion polls, to the thrilled relief of the Treasury. Interestingly, Ed Miliband, his advisor still by 2002 in the Treasury, said to me around that time, that was Gordon Brown's authentic voice. All the stuff about prudence and everything else was trying to let him be a bit more social democratic. And according to Miliband, that was when he did it. But he remained Chancellor for years after that. That was 2002. He'd already been there 5 years. He ended up as Labour's longest serving Chancellor. Huge achievement, but draining, utterly exhausting. Labour Chancellors are in some respects under more pressure than Conservative ones. The markets are more wary, the media more wary. Brown had done it for 10 years. Denis Healey in the 70s, had been Labour's Chancellor for 5 years, admittedly in much more turbulent economic times. But Healey, a tough, formidable politician, spoke in his memoirs of being physically ill by the end of his period as Chancellor. He had found it so draining and stressful. Brown did it for 10, and he did it aching to be Prime Minister, never forgiving Tony Blair for standing in that 94 leadership contest, and as well as all the energy-draining economic policy making, he also used up reservoirs of energy wondering how and when he would be Prime Minister. To give him credit, he was the Prime Minister in waiting for that whole period, from 1994 to when he became Prime Minister in 2007. Most Prime Ministers in waiting never become Prime Minister. Denis Healey was one of them, actually. All the talk when Healey was Chancellor was, well, he'll probably be the next leader or Prime Minister, depending when he got the post. Never got it. Michael Heseltine was a Prime Minister in waiting, never got it. There were lots and lots of examples. Brown was there for 13 years or whatever as a Prime Minister in waiting, and he became Prime Minister. It was a feat of endurance and ruthlessness, because Brown was brought up in the politics of the Scottish Labour Party, where you fight for what you believe in. He, I think, misread the lessons from the Scottish Labour Party. He fought too hard. Wherever he saw someone moving towards a friendship with Blair, he regarded them as a political enemy. He saw everyone virtually in Number 10 as political enemies. This is when he was in the Treasury, obviously not when he was in Number 10. And this was his kind of Scottish Labour Party, the battles that were fought then. This is how he thought politics was done. So famously, he didn't hardly ever speak to Jonathan Powell, who worked in Number 10 for Blair, running Blair's office, etc. And he could have done it differently. The diaries of some of Blair's key allies reveal that they at times thought Blair was moving too far to the right. And there's a wonderfully vivid episode in Alistair Campbell's diaries towards the end of Campbell's time with Blair, where Brown sees him and says, "Alistair, your politics are much closer to mine than Blair's. Why aren't you with me?" And actually, if Brown had played it differently, some of those people might have moved more sympathetically towards him. But the battle was constant, as he saw it and his advisors saw it. And let's be clear, Blair's lot fought as well. It was a duel partly about ambition, but it was about substance as well. And that's the bit that's been overlooked. There was an ideological difference between Blair and Brown and their versions of New Labour. Brown had genuine doubts about some of Blair's public service reforms. He had genuine doubts on those public service reforms. He once delivered a brilliant speech about the relationship between government and markets, and when markets should be left alone, when markets don't work in the delivery of public services, and so on. It was just before the war in Iraq. Hardly anyone noticed. Those that did just saw it as a bid for the leadership. Well, it was partly that, but not all. It was an interesting, deeper reflection on public service reform, especially in relation to the National Health Service. There were strategic differences. Brown was uneasy when Blair chose to define himself against his party at all times. Brown worried that when or if he became Prime Minister, his party would have been so trashed by his predecessor, it would never fully recover. Arguably, something like that happened. So there were all these things going on for so long that when he finally became Prime Minister in the summer of 2007, he was on some levels pretty exhausted. But there is a myth about his leadership, which is this, that having got it, he had no idea what to do with this job that he had ached for so long, that he just wanted to roll in Number 10, get the glory, and then leave. He had a plan. And the plan was this. He would govern almost apolitically for about a year to show that he was capable of rising to the demands of being Prime Minister, because there had been a lot of talk about him not being up to the job, not least from allies of Tony Blair. He wanted to be seen as the father of the nation. He invited Margaret Thatcher in for a cup of tea, partly to torment David Cameron, who was pretending to distance himself from Margaret Thatcher. He rushed back from holiday when there was an emergency of one sort or another. It all got blown away. During that year, by the way, he planned to modify some of Blair's public service reforms, which had alienated many of those who worked for the public services and, to some extent, who used them. He had planned a tax-cutting budget in the March of 2008, and then he was going to hold an election. What he had not realised was that he would have a honeymoon to die for. He had been so used to being unpopular, he couldn't quite believe it, and he hadn't planned for it, that within days of being in number 10, Labour would be miles ahead in the polls again, and his personal ratings would be miles ahead of David Cameron, propelling the speculation about an early election. Now, if he had been smart about it, he would have ruled it out, as Theresa May did when she became Prime Minister. Certainly ruled it out in his own mind. Instead, the idea fermented. He didn't kill off the speculation that there might be election on the foolish reason that that in itself would destabilise the Conservatives. Inevitably, if he didn't hold the election, it was going to destabilise him. And that's what happened. He got caught planning for an election, this father of the nation, this supposedly apolitical figure, and then he didn't hold it. And then he held a disastrous press conference pretending that it had nothing to do with the opinion polls, which were narrowing fast as he came to make the decision as to whether to call the election or not. Gave Cameron a great joke in the following Prime Minister's Questions. He's the only Prime Minister not to call an election because he was afraid he was going to win it. Of course, he was terrified he would lose it, and it was the polls that stopped him from doing it. After that, Brown was without a voice. His public voice had always been rehearsed and practiced. He was never at ease at being himself or appearing to be himself. As himself, I saw it sometimes, he could be witty and engaging. Not always, but he could be hilarious. He had a deep, guttural laugh. He had genuine interest in things many voters have interest in. He loved football, etc. But he was the most rehearsed public figure, partly because he had been responsible for Labour's economic policy for so long, terrified that one word out of place, the whole house of cards would fall. Having chosen to be father of the nation, called out being the most partisan person you could be, which is plotting to win an election, he didn't really have a voice again. And when you lose your voice, it's not just a public voice, you lose it with your party and your cabinet colleagues. And everything else starts to go wrong, which is what happened to Brown after that non-election. Discs were lost with people's social security records. It wasn't his fault. It was a problem with the department that lost the discs, but it all rebounded on him, making him look chaotic and hopeless in the job that he had yearned to prove to people that he could do so well. Inevitably, given all the tensions between those Blairites and Brownites, when things started to go badly wrong, there were plots against Brown. And he was subjected in his relative short period in number 10 to more, I think, active plotting and internal coup attempts than any Prime Minister in modern times. Bizarrely, he was saved by the 2008 financial crash. It was traumatic for him. He had already experienced it the year before with Northern Rock, where that almost went bust. But the 2008 global crash gave him new purpose, a new raison d'etre. It wasn't enough, incidentally, to stop attempts to get rid of him. There were, I think, 2 others after the financial crash, but they were doomed, and rightly so. If, for example, David Miliband had become Prime Minister suddenly in the context of that crash, I think he would have very quickly been overwhelmed. That's not Miliband's fault. He had just had no experience of what to do in terms of an emergency in relation to the economy. Similarly, if anyone else had got it, there was talk of Alan Johnson becoming Prime Minister. Alan Johnson rightly realised he wouldn't know what to do. The one person suitably qualified to respond to a financial emergency of apocalyptic proportions, banks within minutes of going bust, was the figure who had been Chancellor for 10 years. Now, at times he was still impossible to deal with, communicated poorly, but he knew who to phone, what to do. He had a contacts book to die for. And when he hosted the G20 in London following the financial crash, it became an event of great significance in that he almost single-handedly, although it must be said with the help of the then newly deified President Obama, persuaded even fiscal conservatives like Chancellor Merkel in Germany to introduce a fiscal stimulus which arguably stopped the global economy falling into a depression. Indeed, one Nobel Prize winning columnist in the New York Times, Paul Krugman, famously wrote that Brown had indeed saved the world, a phrase that Brown noted and accidentally repeated during Prime Minister's questions. Who could blame him when he was being buffeted with the newspaper headlines from a dark, dark place, and then to read this one about him saving the world, it would have stood out. One of his flaws as a leader was his obsession with the media. He got up very early, famously, and one of the first things he did was to read all the newspapers. And by the end, indeed the middle of his leadership, the papers were terrible. Even sympathetic columnists were writing him off. And it tormented him. It is one of the great ironies that, as with Blair, who sought to be trusted and then was mistrusted to the point that voters or some thought he had lied to go to war, Brown had ached before fighting a general election to make sure the media was on his side, especially the Sun newspaper. He used to invite the then editor of the Sun to parties at Chequers, pillow parties, things like this, I think Rebecca Brooks got invited to. Whenever Rupert Murdoch was in town, Gordon Brown made sure he was one of the first to see him. And towards the end, he got up and read terrible, terrible newspaper headlines. Meanwhile, David Cameron was getting a good press, his opponent. One of the ways he managed this internally was a twist of Shakespearean proportions. The person Brown had fallen out with more intensely than anyone else in his career, and he fell out with a lot of people, from Blair to his old friend or foe Robin Cook from Scottish politics. The one most of all was Peter Mandelson, who he felt betrayed him when, in the end, Mandelson backed Blair for the leadership in 1994. They hardly spoke, and when they did, they shouted at each other. In his darkest hour, when Brown was worried that one of these coups would remove him, he did an extraordinary thing. He brought Peter Mandelson back into his cabinet. When he told his advisors, his old friends, the two Eds who were now ministers, that he was going to do this, they could hardly believe it. They had spent so much time seeing their old boss, Gordon Brown, fume against Peter Mandelson. Have you heard what he's doing now? Have you heard what Peter's doing? Or have you heard what Mandelson's doing? It wasn't Peter by this point. And yet, it was an example of how Brown's political skills had not become entirely numbed by his long period in politics. The return of Mandelson, with whom he once had a close friendship and political rapport, calmed the ship politically. They actually worked reasonably well together in the years that followed, and Mandelson started to work quite well with Ed Balls and others. And there was one further attempted coup against Brown. It was when James Purnell resigned suddenly from the cabinet, and others might have followed. Mandelson was Brown's key ally, the person with whom he had had feud after feud, saved him and kept him in number 10. Mandelson phoned up others, David Miliband, to make sure that they were going to stay on board, and they did. So, although Brown was never good at party management, he was really good at keeping his allies on board, and his allies remained utterly loyal to him until the end, the two Eds, the people who worked with him behind the scenes. But in terms of broader party management, he knew how to make enemies without even trying. And yet here was a moment of skill which kept the thing going until the election held in 2010. When that election was held, most newspaper columnists were predicting a big overall majority for David Cameron. Indeed, some columnists were already appointing speculatively Cameron's first cabinet. They had written Brown off, a writing off that was confirmed in their eyes by the election campaign that followed. It included that nightmare for Brown when he was caught on camera describing a voter as that bigoted woman in relation to someone talking about immigration. But the election result in 2010, I think, sums up the ambiguity of Brown's record. He almost stayed on. Cameron didn't win an overall majority. It was a hung parliament. And for 5 days, certainly for some of that 5 days, there remained the possibility that this figure who had fought so hard to get this job might keep it for a little bit longer. It didn't happen, and Brown left number 10 with his family, went up to Scotland, partly, I think, relieved but also dazed by what had happened to him over the years. Tired and, like Blair, unsure whether he would have much of a voice in British politics again. A figure who ached to be popular, often was, but by the end hadn't done enough to win an election.